Okay, good afternoon, Dad.
Good afternoon.
Today is Friday, September 12th, and yeah, the Charlie Kirk thing has been on my mind a lot. It was a tough thing to watch, and the thing that's been bothering me more actually is just seeing the response from so much of the country. And it's kind of shocking. There's so many people that are celebrating his death, saying he's just, good riddance. He's a piece of trash, and these people are getting a lot of engagement. It's a popular sentiment. If you go on places like Reddit or Twitter X, and I just found that kind of shocking. Like something such a public assassination. He's a young man, similar age to me. He has two little kids, basically the same age as my kids. It's a heartbreaking thing to see,
Mhm.
and then when I see so many people that are just like, yeah, that piece of trash, good riddance. It's like, why? How did we create a society that openly celebrates this? And is it something that is just a really recent development? I just don't think we would have responded like this 10 years ago. Is it because
Uh-huh.
political assassinations have become normalized, and I just feel like we're slipping into darkness.
Right. Well, there were a number of very high-profile political assassinations during the 1960s. I mean, that was a very tumultuous decade. I remember the assassination of Reagan, or the assassination attempt, I should say, of course, of Reagan by John Hinckley Jr. And I remember being shocked. I was working at a newspaper at the time, and one of the writers, frankly expressed her approval, of the assassination attempt, and her disappointment that it was not successful. But that was rather unusual. And of course, we didn't have social media at that time, so maybe there was more of that sentiment than I realized, that social media sometimes magnifies and brings those kind of sentiments to our attention. Uh, but I think there's no question there's just been a general coarsening of the culture over the last couple of decades, at least. Probably the last several decades, and where taboos, respect for the dead, and the uh, taboos against celebrating murder, which, but obviously, this is what that was, were generally respected, and they're just less respected these days.
Well, well, why have we become like this? And it makes me not want to live in a society in a country that is like this, where you feel like it's okay to, if they're the enemy, they're dehumanized. It's okay that they're dead. It's okay to kill them. It's like
Uh-huh.
it's good riddance. That's somehow a good thing. I don't
Yeah.
like it.
Yeah, no, it's a very dangerous sentiment. I think it's symptomatic of the increasing polarization that we see. There isn't much of a middle anymore. Again, votes in the Senate tend to be just down strict party lines. There just aren't many people. That wasn't true again when I was young. There was a kind of a big moderate middle, and that was real. There were, you didn't see those really strict party line votes. Those were the exception rather than the rule. And then and then, of course, the media landscape is very different. It used to be that there were the big three news networks, and they made an attempt. I think they tended to kind of tilt towards the liberal side. I think most people would admit that. But they did make a real attempt to be overall, to be fair, and to aim towards the middle, and that had a moderating influence, I believe, on the society. We don't have that anymore. We have a very different media landscape where actually the way that get more clicks or likes or whatever is just by taking the is by preaching to the choir and taking things to an extreme. You can say, we're part of that landscape, but we should try to fight that, and be as objective as possible. But a lot of people don't, and that a lot of pundits out there, influencers or whatever, don't. I have to say that, like, with in the case of Charlie Kirk, um, I would hear about him from time to time. I was aware of him, And there were a lot of, I think, very legitimate criticisms directed against him. That, for example, that he was a real, um, he was a Trump supporter, but one who just simply, almost axiomatically supported Trump, even when Trump flip flopped. For example, in the case of Epstein, he basically told his followers, "I'll stop bringing this up." You find a lot of instances of that, or the attack on Iran. At first it would be crazy to attack Iran or whatever, but then Trump was great for doing it. And, there are things like that I think you could criticize him on. But from from what I've heard from many different sources, he was actually very civil in his engagements with the other side. He was not part of that, that polarizing, dehumanizing tendency that you were just lamenting. He in fact, engaged in debate. That was what he did, and he did it civilly. And I don't think anybody has said otherwise. And so he was, though I think you can again direct many, many, many legitimate criticisms against him. They to kind of have like to as I to blame him and make him a part of this, this really ugly kind of polarization, I think is unfair. At least in some very important respects, he fought against that. And then, again, he actually did platform people that opposed the views that he espoused. Most famously with Dave Smith. Recently on the Palestinian issue. So anyway, I just thought I would mention that and say, yeah, it is a very alarming phenomenon, and I'm aware of all this. That's the celebrations by some people on the leftist side. I don't know what percentage of leftists actually do that, but it's there. It obviously is, and it's very disturbing. But then also there is, there have been some alarming statements by people on the right, among his supporters, where, which seem to threaten violence or, civil war. And it makes you, I don't think there's going to be any outbreak of civil war soon, but you just feel like this is another milestone, maybe, down the path to some civil war in the future. It's not a foreseeable future, I would say right now, but it is, the trend is alarming.
Right. Yeah, I think Charlie Kirk was, I think he was an important voice for the right. And I think he was bringing people that were on the far right, that were hardcore Zionists. I think he was beginning to question some of his Zionist ideas and principles. And, if he was still alive today, and if he was on the trajectory he was going, where he was on his own discovery of what Zionism is, what Israel really is, and he was beginning to speak out about it. He pushed back against the anti-Semitism laws because he's been a bit of a free speech absolutist. He also went to Trump and told him, like, this war with Iran is going to make you lose your base completely, that don't do this. No Americans, the youth, definitely don't want another forever war. So he was aware of that. And I know I shared videos with you just showing in the past month, he was starting to make that journey and question, like, why is it that we can't criticize Israel? Or when I host somebody and I moderate a debate and I give equal time to the pro-Palestine and then equal time to pro-Israel, then all of a sudden, all of the Israeli propagandists, influencers come out and start labeling me an anti-Semite. He started going down there, and it just seems like the Christian Zionist in America, that's such a key demographic for Israel. If they lose that, then I think it's over. And I have a feeling that Charlie Kirk, as well as Megyn Kelly, I showed you clips of Megyn Kelly before where she was just like, hey, this is kind of weird how people are saying I have to come to Israel and support them now. She's like, I'm not going anywhere. And so her and Charlie were just recently, the past month, talking about this. They were talking about Epstein as well and his connection with Mossad. They were doing some noticing. And I just felt like, if Charlie Kirk wasn't assassinated, if you didn't care, didn't agree with him, he, like you said, he had civil debates. And I think he had some integrity as well. And when you would see him do these prove me wrong debates. And there would be times, especially when it came to the Palestine issue, where his arguments were just garbage. You're just saying, well, it says in the Bible, bless Israel. And like that's all he got, Charlie. And it was exposing him. And I think and because he was willing to engage in that type of dialogue, he was slowly beginning to open his mind and be like, look, if I want to be intellectually consistent and have integrity, my arguments aren't working. This is the whole point of what I do, is to engage in the free marketplace of ideas and see which ideas win. And my ideas that I've held so strongly as a dispensationalist, as a Zionist, I'm having some cognitive dissonance. It's not working. And I really think that was happening. And yeah, so and then of course, then you just go down the whole rabbit hole of, well, if that really is the case, and does Israel benefits from it? Is there something else behind it? I don't know if we want to go too much into that, but well, I just feel like, go ahead.
Right. Well, well, first of all, I would say, there certainly is evidence that he was beginning to question it. And I think you can say, like Piers Morgan, Piers Morgan's been just a very strong Zionist, I think, all his career. But to his credit, he would bring on people from the other side and would debate with them. And it seemed to, in the end, actually to have affected his views somewhat. I don't think he's moved that much, but he has moved some, and is beginning to see that, okay, wait a second, there are some real problems here. And, maybe we could see that Charlie Kirk was on the same trajectory for some similar reasons. And, we just don't know how far he would go. Maybe it would never go that far. It's just unfortunately, we'll never know, because his life has been snuffed out, just at the beginning of this process. It may have led to a dramatic change, maybe not. We just don't know. But then I was just going to say that, I know you've been very occupied with your two boys recently, but the alleged assassin, has been detained and identified. And, according to the initial reports, he was somebody that was obsessed, was an anti-Trumper who was telling people, his relatives, that Charlie Kirk was spreading hate, which just seems like I think a ridiculous charge. And so it looks like, at this point anyway, it's too early. Let's wait for an investigation to take place and you see real solid evidence. This is all sort of at the rumor stage, that he was an unhinged, anti-Trump, and therefore anti-Charlie Kirk assassin.
The problem for me though, Dad, is that I'm at this point where I just don't trust anybody, unless I need complete transparency on this. When they said, okay, good, Kash Patel and the FBI, they're coming down and take over, I'm like, they might be the ones in on it. Don't tell them to come. You know what I mean? Like, I'm at that stage. I'm like, no, don't do that. So it's like, how am I supposed to feel reassured that, like, this, I did just see the news right before we started this, and about this guy, Tyler Robinson, that they arrested. First of all, there's still no confession. Maybe by the time this is out, there is a confession. Like, we haven't heard anything from him, so it's just like, and they said he was on some Discord servers and spreading his ideas and talking about it. It's like, well, who was he talking to? What servers was he in? Like, was he being radicalized? Was this a lone operation? Who was that George Zint guy, that was yelling, shoot me, I'd do it again. Like, why was he there? There's just so many questions that I just need to have answered. And I just have a feeling we're not going to have them answered. And then, like you said, well, I don't know if you just said this, but I think part of the problem as well is just that there's this danger that we will just all want to see what we want to see, to fit this narrative. And the internet is big enough now that everybody can do that. It's like, if you wanted him to be somehow connected to some kind of trans activist, or if you want to just tie it to Israel, which that's the route I automatically kind of go down. But I know that, like, maybe I have my biases, but I have a lot of questions still. So I don't know if we get into that. But I mean, if you want to say it's just the left or radical Islam, that's the problem. Every group can grab onto this and use it to generate hate towards the other group and foment more division, unless we have complete transparency. And in these types of moments, there's a chance that can we come together and unite behind a tragedy. But what we see, in my mind, is that's impossible. Those days are over. Seeing the responses from so many people, whether they're Ukrainians or, you people on the left or whatever it is, just celebrating. It's just like, there's no way. There's no way we can heal. Like if we can't even give somebody dignity in death within 24 hours. The guy was shot in the neck horrifically in front of his wife and kids. Come on, guys. Like this is, I don't know. I just feel like we're slipping into darkness. It's getting darker and darker, and just demons are coming out, everywhere. And
right. Well, that's one of the problems, again, with the loss of legitimacy, of our institutions. In this case, we're talking about, the FBI. That's just one example. It used to be, it has much less legitimacy now than it did in the past. I mean, I think among leftists, it's been, very committed leftists. Back when I was young, there was a lot of questions about the FBI, and it was seen as really kind of an arm of the right wing within the United States. There was something that used to persecute leftist organizations and go, after civil rights groups during the 60s. That was generally believed by the leftists. But this has really changed over the years, and now we find, I think, its overall credibility, legitimacy has declined among all groups, but particularly now on the right, because of things like January 6th and other instances. So now there's this great vacuum. It used to be that, that's the thing, that public institutions are kind of the role that they would play. They were in these times of trouble, and this kind of crisis, we turned to them, and we had this faith that they would address these issues fairly, and that we would learn the truth, and then we could move on. And but because this assassination is preceded by a crisis of legitimacy, we don't really have that. I think that's something I was saying earlier. Is just that we're going into some really dangerous times with a much weaker country overall. I mean, a country where there's, again, we just don't have these institutions that carried us through in the past. Again, the 60s were a very tumultuous decade, but by and large, like trust in the media was very, considerable on both the left and the right, just to give one example. And that's something that, though there was real violence and there were riots and there were assassinations, we got through it. And the government never was close to, actually being overturned or collapsing or anything like that. This time, I'm just not so sure. We're still a long ways from an actual collapse. Maybe I don't know how long in terms of time, but I just can't see it. But we have much weaker institutions. And so when things like this happen, there's because a lot of people just don't trust the FBI and other, investigative authorities. Then in that vacuum, just all kinds of conspiracy theories bloom, and because you just, and again, we just kind of tend to go to, or each group goes towards his favorite or its favorite conspiracy theory. That's what happens.
right. Yeah. And so, let's pray for transparency so we don't go into that
Right.
that hole where everybody just parks in there. But what's particularly gross, I think, about these, political assassination, something like Charlie Kirk, is just because it's a political assassination, people want to use it to stoke hate and divide and further their cause. I mean, we just saw it, immediately with Netanyahu. He's just, first of all, it's just so crazy that this guy that's committing a genocide in Gaza, he hasn't really been on the news that much recently. But as soon as Charlie Kirk dies, everyone's like, well, we better see what the president of Israel has to say about it, And then he just used it to talk about Judeo-Christian values and how that, the radical Islam and the progressive left have combined, and this is a force that all of civilization needs to combat. Just to give him this mouthpiece to push his just hateful, demonic rhetoric that it's just. I don't. It's strange, right? Don't you find that odd that he's just able to come on right after and just talk about it? And then you see people in Israel, they're painting murals to Charlie Kirk, this great hero, which I know he was a hardcore Zionist. But like I said, just go on X and just see what he's been saying the past month, talking about Mossad, talking about secular Jews and what they've been doing in America. He started saying some things, talking to Ben Shapiro, saying like, "Hey, are they ethnic cleansing?" Just asking some questions like, we push back on COVID and on lockdowns, everything. Why do we trust the media when it comes to Israel? How do we know they're telling the truth? He says that, Ben Shapiro. And then that was like, I think, this last interview he did. It's just, yeah,
well,
I don't know.
right. Well, first of all, I would say I'm not surprised that, that we hear from Netanyahu. And Netanyahu obviously just has a great deal of influence in the country, especially a lot of connections to powerful people. So, yeah, the media is going to turn to him. And, yeah, this is part of what he's been pushing all along. Israel represents the forces of civilization, Hamas of the forces of barbarism, and that's it. So don't look beyond that. Don't look at the starving children. Don't look at the assassinated journalists and doctors and the residential towers that are being blown up. Just remember, it's civilization. So anything that happens there is part of that great cosmic struggle. That's what he's been doing all along, and he's actually been very effective at it. So I don't think we should be surprised that he's trying to make Charlie Kirk, to take advantage of Charlie Kirk's death in this way. Yeah, but of course, he has been, I think, a hardcore Zionist for most of his career. But in recent months, in reaction to the things that you've talked about, he has taken a lot of flack from Zionists. They're upset and alarmed about some of the things that he's done. So, yeah, both of those things are true. He's been a hardcore Zionist, but then he started to look like he was starting to kind of leave the plantation potentially. Again, it was too early to say, but it wouldn't prevent somebody from Netanyahu as claiming him as one of their own and making a martyr out of him for the cause of the struggle against so-called barbarism.
I wonder how just everyday Americans, even conservatives, like, how do they feel when they see Netanyahu on their television? It's like, I feel like most people kind of have a little sick feeling, right? I mean, they have to. Just like, why is this guy here telling us,
Well, you would think so. I think the number of people who have that reaction is growing, but there are a lot of people that really admire him within this country and see him as a model. Like he's a guy who just doesn't kid around. Yeah, again, I've talked about there is this, a fairly large segment of the population that thinks like, the problem with the U.S. is that we haven't taken our gloves off. And I think Trump has appealed to those people to a certain extent. And, our model really is Netanyahu and the IDF. That's who we should be. We should learn from them and start, I think that attack on the speedboat was an example of that. It appeals to that segment. And unfortunately, that segment is real. So he still has his supporters, unfortunately. There is that kind of just I guess the reptilian part of the brain that kind of just glories in direct violence, without really any effort to understand what's going on and whether or not it's actually promoting any interest or if it's, whether or not it's close to being moral. It's just there are people who would rather just shut off those concerns and just glory in violence.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's just becoming too commonplace in our time now. I mean, just the number of assassinations, I can't even keep up with it. The attempt. I mean, we had those Minnesota lawmakers like Fizzo. I mean, there's Trump. No, Charlie Kirk, and I know there's so many more. And then, of course, there's just Israel just going on an assassination spree, decapitating everybody in the Middle East. The Yemeni prime minister and his cabinet gone, Nasrallah gone, Hania gone. Raisi was a little sketchy. We don't know about the helicopter crash, but I'm just so many. It's just, and it almost feels like there's some analysts and pundits out there that say that World War III has already begun. And in a way, maybe they're right, because like this type of violence is becoming so commonplace. Like, is this how it begins? We just start killing, political activists. We start killing prime ministers of countries and generals, politicians, candidates. It's like, I mean, we know how World War I started, right? Franz Duke Ferdinand, one shot. It's like, Has it started? Like, is this
Yeah.
what have we normalized? There's a boat in the sea with 11 people. Blow it up. Who cares? Just like Qatar's our ally. Let's bomb them. Let's drop a bomb. Like, what is going on? What is going on here?
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, again, I would say there has definitely been just a degradation of the culture, an increasing coarsening and acceptance of violence, in so many areas. There was, it was actually, I was reading something of course, Exhibit A is Israel. But in Israel, there really has been. I mean, actually, I'm struck by the difference. I was just reading something today that, hey, in past conflicts, for example, I guess it was the first Lebanon war, there were a number of Israeli commanders, there in the IDF who refused to carry out orders because they said this would just lead to too many civilian casualties. They disobeyed orders. They said, this is wrong. This is going to be, you're telling me to, to blow up this building, but I know for a fact that there are at least, a couple of families in there. I'm not doing it. And this happened on more than one occasion. And even in, like in Gaza in 2004, there was, I believe it was an Air Force, an IDF Air Force pilot that was told to take out a building. And he said, I'm not doing it because, there's absolutely no guarantee. There's every reason to believe there's civilians in it. He refused orders. But there has not been, apparently, not one instance, when so many, many more violations, every day. But there has not been one instance of an Israeli, soldiers just saying, no, I can't carry out these orders. Nothing like in the past, not anything of any significance anyway. It's something that the Israelis themselves have been commenting on. They've noticed there's been a change. This is Exhibit A, but it's something that's unfortunately it's just extended to us and whatever. They're just the kind of things that actually would upset us in governments in the past. Oh, they did terrible things, but they felt like they needed to lie about it or cover it up or whatever. But now you find, our people celebrating these acts of terror. These really these war crimes, and so yeah, like that's. As for the question of whether or not World War III has begun, I've heard, again, well-informed, intelligent analysts say that, yeah, it has begun. And I'll just say that they may be right. It's just too early. I don't think we can really call it World War III now. But if we continue on this trajectory and then, it just seems like we're always talking about new wars and new, especially in the Middle East where Israel just doesn't recognize any kind of boundaries. And that was shown, most clearly with this attack on a neutral country and a close ally of the U.S., Qatar, that's worked closely with the U.S. and with Israel in places like Syria in the past. I think, to nefarious ends, but they've worked closely together. And yet, they weren't spared. It just seems like there's the potential, we had that, I think it was really a non-incident that was blown up and described as an attack in Poland. It's just like we're always on the verge of, though the Russians have been careful, to keep it from expanding, there's always a danger that war too will expand into other countries, just like, we see, happening with the Middle East war. So at some point, they can all just come together, and we really could call it a world war. I think it's a little premature, but if it does turn into a world war, I think we'll look back and say, yeah, it was beginning back then.
Let's hope we can look back. I mean, it's scary to think about a world war with such crazy, irrational people in charge. I just I don't know if we can make it through it if we have something like this. I just really hope cooler heads prevail, but it just seems like things are just spiraling out of control bit by bit. It's just like it's not. We've been doing this podcast for I don't know, maybe a year and a half, and it just so much has happened in just 18 months, and it's just getting worse, and it just. Yeah, and the other scary thing, like we we're just saying, is just kind of this poisoning of the soul of our societies, and I think it's happened slowly. I don't know when it's happened, where all of a sudden that we have kind of accepted that think this is okay, where we're in a society where somebody can get shot in the neck while at a public speaking event, and half the country celebrates. Like that's
Yeah, I don't know if it's half the country. It may
Not, yeah,
seem like
okay,
that
not
to me.
half. Yeah,
But
well, if you
right.
go on Reddit, it seems like I know Reddit is
Yeah.
very left, but
Yeah.
it's just, yeah, I just, yeah, pray for the soul of the of the Western world. We've just we've slowly decayed. I don't think we've noticed. I think a lot of it just has to come with just the rhetoric we've been using. We start using dehumanizing language with the other side, and then once you do that, and you just call the MAGA guys, they're all crazy cult MAGA maggots. They're not human. Oh, the lefts, they're just just crazy radical. They're all trannies or whatever. You start using this horrific demonic language, or the worst example, of course, is what the Israelis do with the Palestinians, invoking Amalek, and saying that the Palestinians are just grasshoppers, less than humans. It just and that if you adopt that rhetoric, people just subconsciously you are being poisoned because you're just being exposed to it, and it's like, oh yeah, those people, those are the bad people, right? Those are the evil people. We don't care about them if they die, and it's just, I'm just disappointed in where we are, and I don't have a lot of faith in the future.
Yeah.
Okay, well, maybe we can move on. I hope we can heal as a nation. I have very little hope, but rest in peace, Charlie Kirk. I'm really sorry that happened. It's just, it's horrific. It's a horrific thing to
tragedy.
see. Just feels weird to switch topics. Okay, so, well, yeah, just things are going crazy everywhere else. What do you want to talk about? Qatar, we got drones going to Russia. I mean, well, maybe this could be a segue because we're talking about just the distraction from Charlie Kirk. I just saw 1,500 people being taken hostage from a town in the West Bank of Tulkarm. I mean, it almost seems like this is whenever there's some kind of event like this, we just accept Netanyahu to accelerate something. Everybody's distracted. Just round up 1,500 people, start bombing more people. I don't know.
Right. Well, as I pointed out, I think several times already, it's just, if it wasn't for Gaza and everything else that's happened, Gaza, Syria, Lebanon, Iran, and if we just rolled everything back, several years, and we had going on the West Bank what has been going on ever since October 7th, that would actually be a huge topic of discussion. There would be quite a lot of criticism and a lot of debate and condemnation of Israel for what they're doing in the West Bank, because since October 7th, the Israelis have greatly accelerated their ethnic cleansing campaign in the West Bank. They've seized a lot more land, and destroyed many more homes than they had in the previous, decades, even in many cases. We're seeing like the greatest ethnic cleansing since the '67 war, the 6-Day War. Still a lot smaller than that, but that tells you something. But it just gets so little attention. I don't think, you don't even need to talk about Charlie Kirk. It's just because the horror in Gaza and the craziness, the reckless attack on Qatar and so on. It just means that people are focused elsewhere because those crimes are so huge that they just forget about, again, what's happening in the West Bank, which in saner times would have been the object of everybody's attention.
Right. Well, I mean, what's the newest coming out of there right now with Gaza and the West Bank? I mean, is it just more horror, starvation, bombing? Is
right.
I saw an announcement that Netanyahu just said, "Yeah, we'll make sure that a Palestinian state is dead after this." Like I saw something on.
Well,
on
that's been his position for a long time, basically. And what's happening in the West Bank now is, I think he just inaugurated. I think he was there to kind of oversee the launch of this project to actually cut the West Bank in two. Just create this corridor right through the center of it. It's already been broken up into a lot of smaller pieces, but this would, be the I think the final nail in the coffin was already driven in, but people are saying that this would be the final nail in the coffin. So, it's a major project that would take a lot more of the land and would just completely would actually destroy any semblance of of an actual, potential Palestinian state in the region, in the West Bank. So, that's what's happened there. And there's just daily horror stories. They're not as bad as what happens in Gaza, but people get killed, virtually every day there, and more territory is seized and olive groves are cut down. It's the same thing that we've seen for decades there, but just on a greater scale and also at a much faster pace. There's the ethnic cleansing is happening. It was always happening there, but it was in slow motion for a long time, and now it's really picking up speed. And then Gaza, it's really more of the same. The Operation Gideon's Chariots 2 goes forward. It's mainly consists of destroying these residential towers, and we just don't even know who's inside. I remember reading an account of a family that was in one of those towers. Like the Israelis, the IDF will send some warning generally, but like they give them 15 minutes. Imagine you're a family and you have all your belongings. So in 15 minutes, you got to just get out of there with something. And this family describing they're just in this terrible panic, throwing things out the window, hoping they can get down there and, get it away from the building and it doesn't end up on the rubble and they can get out there and, in time to live. But other families, I'm sure, don't get out. Some just, as they've said, it's just like, I'm not moving again. There's no place to go to. And that's what this family said too. We got out of the building, but now where do we go to? We've told, it used to be like at the beginning of this war on Gaza after October 7th. Okay, your home is destroyed, but you can then call south. You had relatives who lived in the south, and they would immediately accommodate you. It's just oh, don't come here. You can, we've got an extra room, or you can sleep in the living room, or something. We'll find a place for you. Just don't worry about it. And you say now, you call and they say, I'm sorry, we're living in a tent down here. We don't have anything for you. And then you say, the Israelis instruct them to go to such and such place, but that place they regularly attack, and everybody knows it. It's not safe. They say it's a safe zone, but it isn't. And then, they go there maybe, and then they find out there's just no space for them. It's just packed with tents, and there's actually just not a bit of space. There's not, and the accommodations are completely lacking. There just aren't any facilities, maybe a latrine for 500 people or something like that. That's the kind of thing that they're subjected to. So that's a reason, again, that so few people have actually fled. There were over 1 million people in Gaza City, and the Israelis have told them that they all have to go to the south, and they're just saying, why? You're going to kill us there, just kill us here or something. That's the way some of them are thinking.
This just has to stop. Just the death, especially when we see these pictures of children that are being killed. It's just like there's no more moral reason to intervene in something. If we, there's just the suffering is overwhelming. I can't even wrap my head around it sometimes because it's just on such a large scale that it's hard to feel it. Like. I mean,
let me just add real quickly.
Go ahead. Yeah,
it's just like, and then, the deaths from starvation continue. There are several every day confirmed deaths. Direct deaths from starvation, and inevitably, so much of the population's malnourished. That means people are going to be dying of other things, more likely. Or if they've got cancer and you're malnourished, you're going to die sooner of it. Just to give you one example. In the end, we don't even know really the scale of the death from this. But there have been over 400 confirmed deaths, and more than a third of them are children. And then every day, it's just like at least a dozen, sometimes a couple of dozen or more. Aid seekers are killed. In other words, starving people are trying to get some aid, often just dried beans and rice, and they don't even have the water or whatever, and they get shot trying to get this food for their family. It happens every day. Yeah. And that hasn't stopped either.
And sometimes we just think about, oh, well, there's just the people that died, but think about the people that are alive, what type of lives they're having to live. It's just so like my wife is gone for 2 nights, and I just did one night without my wife, and I'm like, I feel like I barely made it. I feel I barely slept. And I had this thought yesterday. I'm like, oh my God, this was so tough for me just by myself. And I was getting prepared. You came over and helped as well last night, everything like this. And it was still just so rough for me. And I'm just thinking, like, how rough is it for some of these families in Gaza that maybe their dad was killed, their mother might be injured. You have no food. You don't have there's no running water. There's no electricity. And I'm like, oh no, it's like Miss Rachel isn't working. What am I? Like it's unbelievable. It's so evil. And
yeah, no, it's it really is.
Yeah. Well, are we going to see a happy ending ever for this? I mean, like what happened in Qatar? Do we have some news there? Like, is Qatar pissed? They better be pissed. I'm pissed.
Yeah, right. Well, unfortunately, there was hope that there would be some kind of ceasefire. Unfortunately, it looked like it was going to be a temporary ceasefire that they, that wouldn't really end the war, but there was going to be some kind of ceasefire. Because again, the Netanyahu government was under a lot of pressure, both international and domestic, to agree to some kind of ceasefire. And I think that was probably the main motivation for this strike on Hamas in Qatar, because that's where the negotiations were playing. This has been the center of negotiations for years and years and years. In fact, again, this office was created with the encouragement of both Israel and the U.S. years ago. But this time he went for him, like he's gone, like Israel's done in the past many times. And, we've named the previous instances. He went after the negotiators themselves to kill the negotiations. And nobody should be surprised. It just seems like, when are we going to stop pretending that the Israelis are actually acting in good faith? I haven't, the whole thing is, that's Qatar, I put forward the theory, because again, this is something that the Wall Street Journal reported, that Qatar approved it in advance. I saw, there's some, you don't hear the speculation so much in the West, but in Israeli media, there is speculation about, whether Qatar knew about it in advance. And one thing that was pointed out is that, look, they had their own air defense. It's not like they're just dependent on the U.S. air base, but they have their own air defense. They bought, I think, 12 Patriot batteries years and years ago, but not one of them was activated. And you just have to wonder, again, I don't know. I can't be sure. I am suspicious. Again, there are these reports that they knew in advance. We'll see. But so far, nothing has happened. It makes me think about the Nord Stream case, where the U.S. actually, I'm confident, blew up the Nord Stream, this infrastructure that was really vital to one of their client states, of course, Germany, and to Europe at large. And Germany never did anything. And we don't know. Maybe the U.S. informed Germany in advance. Maybe they didn't. In a way, it didn't matter. I think the U.S. just assumed that, hey, they're a vassal state. They'll know to shut up. And if that was their calculation, it's been proved correct. And maybe it's something similar. It's like you could say Qatar is the Germany of the Persian Gulf. And if they don't do anything, in the end, it won't really matter. Were they informed ahead of time or not? In any way, they show themselves to be completely supine, just incapable of real independence. Will they tell the Americans the base to close down? I'm afraid not. I don't think that's going to happen. Are they really angry? Maybe. At least some people in Qatar probably are. But who knows? If there's another story out there, which is interesting. I just don't know if it's true. They say maybe the reason that the leadership of Hamas was spared is that because Qatar was informed in advance, some Qatari officials actually notified Hamas. Like probably not everybody was on the same page on this, and they got out. That's a possibility. Who knows what's going on behind the scenes? But it seems like we will know what kind of government Qatar has if they don't do anything. They may go ahead and prove themselves to be the Germany of the Persian Gulf.
Do you think that they have to do it within like the next 2 weeks for it to hold any weight, or if they wait too long, then people are like, okay, what is this? Like, when should we expect some type of
Yeah,
remark
I
or
don't know.
statement or action?
Right. Yeah, it seems like longer. The more time passes, the less likely that anything, that their actions, that they'll do anything meaningful, and that their actions will have a real impact. It will be, if they wait too long, then people won't even connect it with the event, or the connection will be much more tenuous. If they do it fairly soon, within the next few months, and they say this is because of what Israel and the U.S. did, then it will be very meaningful. But I don't expect that they will do anything.
Yeah, I'm just waiting for some action within the Middle East. But every single time we have these discussions, it's always disappointing. It just sounds
Yeah.
like we just have to wait until Israel bombs Iran again, and then we have to just buckle up for just some crazy riot that will probably end with a nuclear weapon. It's just it's such a crazy timeline, right? Isn't that
Yeah.
crazy that's basically what we're waiting for?
Yeah, I'm afraid so. We just don't see any signs. You just hear rumblings, but murmurs of dissent or whatever, but nothing at all significant from any of the neighboring countries. The one country that really opposed them was Syria, and now that government is gone, and now you have a very obviously accommodating government in power there.
Yeah, I'm wondering, are these people, Erdogan and Trump and the Amir, are they all like communicating and they got some plan, like, oh, well, of the new world that's going to come after? I mean, well,
Well,
do they?
Trump has been quite open about it. His great real estate development plan for the Israeli coast. For the former Gaza. It's something I think that actually Netanyahu brought up yesterday. He was there, not in Gaza, but to the north of Gaza. But then he mentioned it. I think he was there to inaugurate some new development on the Israeli coast. But then he mentioned, yeah, and then farther south in Gaza, we have our plans. And he kind of referenced Trump's, um, wonderful new, I don't know what he's going to call it, but his
Do you
Trump
think that
villas on the Mediterranean coast there.
you think that's what we'll see when this is all said and done? That Gaza, that Israel will either push or kill everybody in Gaza, kill them
Well,
all
I
or
think
push
there's
them
no
all out,
question. Yeah, I
and then
don't think
build
there's
villas?
that's a possibility. It's you would just hope at some point, that there would be real resistance and some power would put a stop to it, but we just don't see it happening yet. There has been increased pressure. There have been some mostly symbolic moves by European leaders. Probably the most meaningful one was by the German government. They said that they were going to stop selling arms to Germany, but then apparently they just inked some
Israel.
sort of arms deal with Israel just the other day. So I don't think that was very meaningful. I think these are just gestures, and the Israelis, see them as such. They're not. They just don't seem to be scared. I think there are. It seems like it's like previous prime ministers and generals and so forth have been ringing the alarm bells and saying Israel's in real danger. But it seems that's like an earlier generation that used to worry about those things, and the previous one is just and the new Netanyahu, they just don't. They've decided to throw caution to the winds, and they just believe they can get away with murder, and so far they have.
It's just been painful to watch this just keep on going, and nobody does anything. Should we move over to anything else you want to say about the Middle East, Dad?
No, I think we could move on to probably Russia,
Okay,
and
so
because
what's the big news is the drones, right?
yeah, that was of course the Europeans made quite a lot out of that. That was just in the headlines, and a lot of claims that this was a Russian attack. Now it's interesting that there's something like you have to notice, like when you get to the official statements from NATO, they're actually much more conservative, and NATO apparently actually did in an official statement said this was not an attack. And I think we can also see it from what Poland, even though the Polish prime minister and then later the president have been, really milking this for all it's worth. And of course, Zelensky is just like, I think he's tweeting something every 10 minutes about, the terrible Russian attack on Poland. But then you look at it and say, what did they actually do officially? They didn't invoke Article 5. And in fact, if they believed it was an attack, that's what they would have done. Now, Article 5 doesn't actually, require any country to go to war with Russia, but it does. It is a statement that we have been attacked and we need support. But they went to Article 4, which means that officially they're not even really saying that it was an attack. And so I think it like behind the scenes, everybody knows that it wasn't an attack, but it's just but these politicians and the media are playing this game. Again, it's another opportunity to demonize Russia and to create pressure for more support for Ukraine. And the Poles are trying to get some new systems out of this. They're asking for Patriot systems, which is silly. Maybe in 20 years or something, they're going to be put at the back of the line, and I don't know what good they would do against drones. We've learned some more interesting things about this. Again, these drones appear the only ones that have been shown in photos, and there's some weird things about these photos, including the presence of duct tape on one of them, and it's really obvious. You can blow it up and see it. I'm not exaggerating. There's duct tape.
That NATO budget's in trouble, huh?
Well, no, this would have to be the Ukrainians, I think, that did it.
Well, that's a NATO budget,
we'll get
right?
Into that. Yeah, we'll get into that later, but. The photos that they've shown are not Garand drones. They're the so-called, the Gerbera drones, which are usually used as decoys, and sometimes are used as relays. In other words, they transmit relay signals, to the Garands that are farther ahead. And this raises some interest. Well, first of all, they don't carry warheads. I guess it's theoretically possible you could put a very small warhead in there, but nobody's talked about any explosion. There was some claim that one did damage to a house, but then the Poles themselves, there was a picture that appeared. Oh, this house has been damaged by the Russian attack. But then actually the Poles themselves, like neighbors, said, no, this was damaged in a storm 2 months ago. That's the same picture that we saw 2 months ago. But it seems to be part of this coordinated campaign to pretend there was an attack. But then it hasn't really been done very well because, again, you see the duct tape, you see the drone sitting on top of a really kind of flimsy, very old and obviously not very sturdy chicken coop. And they're not Garand drones, they're Gerbera drones, which are, again, generally used as decoys. So what's going on? And now quite a few people have put forward the theory that this was a false flag. And I think there's strong evidence for that, in that these Gerbera drones, according to Wikipedia, they only have a range of 500 kilometers. So they could not be, there's no way that they could reach Poland from Russian occupied territory. It's just not possible. They wouldn't get close. Now, the Ministry of Defense said 700 kilometers. They didn't name what kind of drone it is, but even 700 kilometers still would not get you to Poland from, the closest point within Russian occupied territory. And then you see the duct tape, and you start to wonder, this is a theory that's been put out there, and I find it very believable. It's just that these drones, again, they're generally used as decoys. Some of them are shot down, but others just run out of gas and just land somewhere.
I think they're all battery powered, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Probably.
Okay, yeah. Probably. I don't know.
It's not the 50s anymore. I know you're not that
okay.
old,
Well, I mean, some of them. Obviously, some of them do have fuel, because the Grand 3s have jet engines.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So anyway, I don't think that can be.
All right. I stand corrected. All right.
Yeah. Well,
I'm just thinking of the little play drones.
Yeah. You're right. But I kind of essentially, I'm just I'm speaking figuratively. Ran out of gas, or the battery ran down, or whatever, and they landed. And so there have been a lot of these, that have been used. Again, we've had these very large-scale attacks. So even if there's just 10% of them are these decoys, but maybe a larger percentage, the Russians are going to mix in decoys with the real ones. They've been collecting them, and they decided to use them and just to launch them, because they are Russian drones, and then they can launch them into into Poland. That's a possibility. So maybe this was a pure false flag, or it was a combination of a false flag and a certain number of these drones. Well, again, though, they don't have the range. So the only other possibility I could think of was that they were actually launched from within Belarus. And Russians have said, of course, that they did detect these drones and they notified Poland.
Right, but that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and then the Poles, earlier they didn't acknowledge, but actually the Polish military has acknowledged that is true, that they in fact were warned about them by the Belarusians. Okay,
so it sounds pretty false flaggy, right?
that seems to be where all the evidence is going. And again, this is, he had the motive. Zelensky did. He had the means. We know that they've been collecting these, or they certainly were able to collect these over a period of time, and there've been more and more of them. And then he has a record. He's done it. He's done it before. And again, it was just 2 weeks ago that the former President Duda said that in November of 2022, they fired an S-300. Now, there was a lot of discussion, like maybe this was an S-300 that just went off course and the Ukrainians took advantage of that. I remember at the time, Scott Ritter, who was an expert on, missile technology, that was something that he had to, that was his special area of competence when he worked for the U.S. military. Said that that's just not possible, that it's just like it can't just go off course. If it goes off course, this was a self-destruct, but this, he believed back then that it was fired deliberately into Poland. Again, it killed a farmer. Immediately, the Ukrainians jumped on it and started pressuring the Poles to declare Article 5. And President Duda, at the time, apparently felt like he was under a lot of pressure, but refused to do it. So again, we have a precedent. This is something they've done in the past. So I think there's every reason to be very, very suspicious. Again, we can't prove it. It hasn't been confirmed. But if you just look at the facts, it's like it seems the only thing that really makes sense to me.
Well, from what you said as well, it seems like it was rather poorly planned as well for a false flag. And if they're trying to sell this false flag to the European people, I imagine they're not buying it. What's the reception been?
Well, actually, there was a poll taken in Poland itself. And, according to this one poll, I think it was 38% believed it was the Ukrainians, 34% believed it was the Russians.
So more people even in Poland?
Like the Poles themselves. So, that's very interesting. So it's like, I think the Poles themselves, they understand, they seem to have a better sense of what kind of government they're dealing with in Ukraine than the average European, because they've had their conflicts over the ultranationalists. The ultranationalists refused to apologize, for the atrocities that were committed. There was one massacre in particular that caused the death. That caused the deaths of over 100,000 Poles, and it's something that the Poles will not forget. But that's a real point of friction because, I think eventually there was some kind of statement that came out of the Ukrainian government, but there's a lot of resistance to that, and a lot of anger on the Ukrainian side. They don't, again, Bandera and his people, the ones who carried out this massacre are their heroes, and so the Poles are aware of that. The Poles tend to be, unfortunately, by and large, I think more so in the political class than among the common people, but by and large tend to be, very real Russophobes. But they also are, I think, much more clear-eyed about the Ukrainians themselves. So that poll result shouldn't be too surprising. But it seems to have fooled so much of the world, or the West, that is just fed this propaganda nonstop, that this was some sort of, unprovoked attack on Poland. The whole thing was really absurd, with duct tape planes landing on chicken coops.
So you think that it actually is, they're still controlling the narrative with that most people are just like, hey, what is this? What is this duct tape drone on a chicken coop? Well,
the vast majority of people don't look at that, actual the evidence. And unfortunately, the journalists in the West don't either. They just repeat these things. They almost feel like this is their duty. They're supposed to. And they feel like their duty is to whip it up and then just to go with Zelensky's argument that this is some sort of unprovoked attack. And I think, like, in general, the Western governments, even though I think they know that it wasn't, again, we can see that from the statement by NATO and even the request that was put forth by the Polish government. They're using this to drum up support for more arms and more funds for Ukraine. But interestingly, Trump himself seems to be very reluctant to jump on this bandwagon. Though people like Kellogg and other Ukraine supporters in the U.S. are doing the same thing back here in the U.S. When Trump is asked about it, he always kind of shrugs his shoulders and said, they were shot down. It didn't really do anything. He just refuses to make a big deal about it. And so I think he knows, and it's further evidence that I think he really does want to just kind of to leave Ukraine. He has no love for the Ukrainian government and for Zelensky.
Okay, so do you expect any big consequence from this? It'll just be a big hullabaloo, people will get flustered, and then nothing really happens?
Yeah, it looks like they're resisting. Again, we see that from the NATO statement, that NATO will not become involved, but it will be used, to again boost support. It's just part of this you could say this kind of sabotage effort on the part of all the Ukraine war hawks in the West that went into high gear after the summit meeting in Alaska. We've had all these meetings of the coalition of the willing, and these statements about sending forces to Ukraine and so on and so forth. This I think is just part of it. It's just another propaganda exercise that is used to strengthen the hand of these people who want to again sustain and possibly increase support for Ukraine. But there are countervailing headwinds. Again, we saw that poll in Poland itself, and just in general, the political class is excited about it, but as we pointed out many times, the average citizen in Western Europe is really not eager to send more money to Ukraine. They increasingly see they've got their own problems, and that's in places like France. It's that those problems have reached a crisis point.
Right. Yeah, these actions, like these false flags and false narratives that are being pushed out, I think they have to be quite damaging for Ukraine in the long run, though, right? I mean, they may get some short-term wins and drum up a little bit of support and excitement, but the problem is like what we see with Poland. I think the reason that we have more people think that it was Ukraine that flew the drones in than Russia, even though they're Russian drones, and the goal is to get Poland geared up, is because once the conflict starts to get a little bit close to you, then you start looking at things a little bit more closely. If we're here in the U.S., it's like, oh, I heard some Russian drones going to Poland. For the average American, they're like, I don't even know where Poland is. It's like, yeah, that sounds about right. I'm sure that's happening. I know there's a war in that part of the world. But once the war starts to get closer to you and like, hey, it's time for you to gear up and go to Ukraine, you're going to start looking at these stories a little bit more closely. Like, okay, wait, why are we doing this again? Let me take a look. Oh, this incident? Wait, that duct tape thing? That's the reason?
Right.
And then so for Poland, it's their country. They flew in. They're looking at it more closely.
Right.
The other countries aren't looking as closely. But if they ever do get to that point, you start to pull on one of those threads. You start going down this rabbit hole of false narratives and all these other things. The Israelis did the same thing to such a greater extent. And that rabbit hole goes forever. Once you fall down that rabbit hole, I feel like you can't come out. But it's starting to be the same thing with Ukraine too.
Yeah. Well, I would say, first of all, with Poland, this so-called incursion happened on their own territory. And, we're told that this was major. There was, according to some accounts, 19, others 25. And then the NATO scrambled its jets, sent in F-35s and shot them down and whatever. And when the Poles are there, this is their own territory. They could see these two, or three ridiculous pictures they see the picture of the house and they immediately debunk it. Hey, this is my neighbor's house. I know what happened here. And so they hear about this, this is their own territory. So it's kind of harder to pull the wool over their eyes and say, basically nothing happened. This is what they're saying. But back in the U.S., it's really been, it's simply declared as, a Russian attack. And there's very little, again, people are completely ignorant. Like you say, they barely know where Poland is, and a lot of people believe it. But it's got to have, I think there's a danger. Like every time Zelensky pulls a stunt like this, and he's pulled many, the attacks on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant are another thing. I think that, like among themselves, these leaders have to know NATO actually knows what's going on. And, it's whispered into the ears of different leaders. And they don't say it, because they understand there's this information war and they let the media just, declare all this. They actually think it's to their advantage. But then there must be part of them that's thinking like, this guy's kind of crazy, this Zelensky guy. And he really does lie a lot. They're not going to go out and say that publicly. But I'm sure there's a lot of whispering about that and some kind of concern. And, over time, that's, I think you're right, that's got to hurt the Ukrainian position.
Yeah, I mean it's the whole Western world. It's just we're an empire of lies, but people are starting to realize it. And then once you do that, like I said, you pull on that thread, and everything is falling apart. And people are trying to create more lies and stoke more division and start fires elsewhere. So it just becomes, when you call very powerful people out on their lies like this, it can be dangerous. And I think that's just, just more fuel to the fire. We're in a very dangerous time right now. I just really feel like it's, we've been talking about this stuff for a while, and I know things have been bad. I don't know why the Charlie Kirk thing just kind of hit home. Maybe it's just I wasn't expecting to see it. I didn't know that he got shot. I just opened up my phone and it popped on Twitter X, and it just sometimes I wonder as well, like, the compassion that I have, or the feelings that I have for Charlie Kirk were high, and I've gone through emotional moments seeing things happen in Gaza as well. But the stuff that's in Gaza is happening constantly every day. But I guess it's normal that I would feel something because I saw it. It's Charlie Kirk is an American, somebody that I've listened to before. I know him. He's part of it. And it was such a public setting. Maybe that's why it was just more upsetting. I'm just wondering, just with my own personal feelings, like, why do I feel this way? And then, I obviously I feel when I see things, what happens in Gaza. Maybe it's...
I don't think there's any mystery. First of all, right, you saw it almost in real time. And on the soil of your own country,
right. Looked like my college campus. Could have been the same,
right. Right. So I think I fortunately did not see it, the video, but I know other people have, and everybody who's seen it has actually been very disturbed by it. It is very, very graphic. I understand, and then when that his wife and children were right there, it is a horrible tragedy. Again, like you say, there are just tragedies like that happen in Gaza every day. But it is naturally you're going to feel something that's closer to, you're going to feel it more when it's closer to home. And I don't think there's any mystery about that.
Right. Yeah, and I think there's just something that's disturbingly numb when you see a building collapse, and there might have been 100 people in there, but you don't see it, you don't hear it. It just falls down, and right. But there could have been all these kids in there. I'm sure there were. It's just, but that's why it just surprises me. Then, if, like you're saying, if it is something about proximity, that we haven't seen an uprising in Egypt, for example. I mean, I understand the power of the Israelis and their air force and what they could do, but
it's also, it is a complicit government. It's a government that's been bought off and is corrupt. It's a very poor country that survives on subsidies from the U.S., subsidies that are provided, with the condition that you cooperate with the Israelis, and that's been true ever since the peace deal back in the 1970s. So that's just That's a fact. I know there are. I don't know the extent of of Egyptian feeling, but I know that like the Egyptians have done things like actually had marches to the border trying to bring supplies. So there has been some sort of effort among civilians to do something. Again, but they are a very poor people, who are under the thumbs of a very violent government, of a corrupt police state. That's the truth. These things happen. We just don't see any signs of anything happening there. But these things always take you by surprise. I've been talking about an uprising, or they take you by surprise. Everybody by surprise when they do happen. So who knows? Maybe in the near future we will see something there. But right now we don't see any signs of real resistance in Egypt or Jordan.
Okay. Well, yeah, let's pray for the people of Palestine as well. And the suffering is just unbelievable there. And it just keeps on getting worse. I mean, just all around the world too. I mean, just in Ukraine too, the Ukrainians, the Russians that have died. There's so much death is happening now, and I just feel like it's picking up steam. Dark times, Dad. Dark times. I just don't see a way out of this. I just feel like the dying is going to increase rapidly. Hope I'm wrong. I really hope I'm wrong.
No,
okay.
You are too.
Well, I want you to tell me I'm wrong.
I'm afraid I can't do that.
Okay. All right, Dad. Well, is there any final words?
No. I think we can
okay.
end it there.
All right. Sounds good. All right. Have a good rest of your day and a great weekend.
Okay. You too.
Or maybe I'll see you soon. I'll have
right. Yeah.
I might need a nap at some point.
Understood.
Okay. Yeah, I need to check. Seems like Felix still asleep, so we're okay.
Okay.
All right. Goodbye, Dad.
Yeah, goodbye.
All right, bye-bye.